here.
Okay.
All righty. Welcome and thank you for coming. We are going to share 3 tough conversations every parent needs to have before their child leaves home. So if you are getting ready to send a child into the world, it doesn't matter if we are talking about a year from now or if we are talking about a matter of weeks, months, or days from now. You may be feeling like this mom right here who is feeling completely overwhelmed by the idea. You may be doing a little bit of this. This is something I find myself doing more and more as my kids are getting closer and closer to leaving home. I find little things will make me cry. You may be wishing that you could just have that little child again that you could scoop up in your arms and not let them leave. Or you may be feeling like you finally reached the end of a tunnel and you're ready, your child is ready, and this is a great thing. And more realistically, you're probably feeling all of the above. Depending on the day and the time, all of those feelings are completely common, normal, and you may be feeling all of them within an hour of each other. I think that's all the norm of what parents who reach this stage of the journey in their parenting all feel. The other thing you're really feeling, and I am feeling, and Amy is feeling, it doesn't matter again how far away it is, the clock is ticking. It just becomes very, very prescient. You just are so aware of how the time is going when it starts, ticking down. There's so much that you want to say. You have probably covered a lot of the basics, or if you are like me, you are trying to cover those basics. My oldest is a year away from leaving home, so we are spending time right now making sure he knows how to scrub a toilet and wash a load of laundry and scramble some eggs and cook some pasta and just some basic reminders all the time, because I do want him to be a good roommate to someone. So those are the basics, but they're also, for all of us, things that you think, I probably am missing something. I know I'm forgetting some things, but there's also things that you kind of know you need to talk about, but you aren't sure how or what to say. Some of these topics are really uncomfortable. And so that's really the point of this conversation today, and the point of why Amy and I are here, why Amy and I came together. So we think we've got something that can help as you prepare. But before we go on to talk about how we can help, let us take just a second to tell you who we are. So if you are watching live or watching this as a recording and don't know me, I am Tonya Crombie. I have a doctorate in psychology. I am an executive and a life coach, and I am the author of Stop Worrying About Your Anxious Child. I predominantly work with people struggling with anxiety and parents of anxious children. That's the topic of my book, and that is the majority of my work. I help parents manage their children's anxiety and be able to just relax and enjoy being a parent again. So that is who I am and what I do, and I'd like to let Amy tell you a little bit about herself.
Thanks, Tonya. It's lovely to be here, and I'm excited to talk about this material with you all because, as Tonya said, we're both mothers and we're getting ready to launch our own teenagers into the world. So who I am is I'm a psychotherapist and an author and an educator. My book is Be Strong, Be Wise in the Age of Me Too. And what I do is I teach young people about sexual safety and sexual assault awareness. And I also teach caring adults who want to offer the framework to the young people in their life. I teach parents and teachers and counselors how to bring the Be Strong, Be Wise framework to their young people. So we are really excited to talk to you about some of the tough conversations that we have at the beginning of this process in launching young adults. And I'm here to talk about sexual safety. So we want to begin with our first slide. So
just before Amy, you jump in, just a quick reminder of the overall conversations we're going to have. We've promised you 3 tough conversations that we need to have as parents. And those 3 conversations are sexual safety, as Amy mentioned, and she's going to jump right into that in just 2 seconds. Then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about anxiety, as you might have guessed, since that is my area of passion and the thing that I love talking about with parents and teenagers and whoever will listen to me, really. And the last of the 3rd conversations is all about social isolation. It's about feeling included. It's about our kids being comfortable in their own skin. And if you are a parent of a child who is getting ready to launch, I think that probably hits home with you too. You probably are saying, yes, I know exactly what you mean by that inclusion, isolation piece. It's really important because it does impact our kids so much as they leave. And it's also the reason it's in this slide. And the reason that Amy and I are even doing this is that is the bridge between both of our topics. It's the way that we came together, because isolation is such a key aspect of sexual safety and anxiety and depression and mental health. And again, like I said, it's just a really important concept in and of itself. So those are the 3 topics. And without further ado, I'm going to let Amy jump right into talking to you about sexual safety.
So one thing that we know, and this is a result of the Me Too movement, although there's been a lot of activity and a lot of discussion and articles being written around the reality of sexual assault. So what Me Too helped to bring forward is an awareness of the scope of the problem, which is pretty massive. So many people, for example, Tarana Burke, who actually founded the Me Too movement in the 90s, has described sexual assault in America as an epidemic. With an assault taking place every 92 seconds, that's an appropriate title. So one of the things that is helpful right now is that, we are able to talk about these things more directly. And I often encourage parents and caring adults to have that kind of join up conversation with their young people to talk about the facts. That helps to create a kind of neutral environment to have further discussion, is to literally share some of the statistics that you're seeing on this slide right now. And they're readily available, with a very minimal search. You will find a lot of information on sexual assault and sexual safety. So one of the things, as I said, Me Too helped break the barriers of secrecy. So now we are, I think, given a responsibility that is empowering at the same time. It's kind of scary and uncomfortable to have these hard conversations with the young people in our life. The good news is young people are very social media savvy. They are aware of what's happening in the world. They were there for the Me Too movement. I guarantee you that every young person that you know probably has at least read in the paper an incident of sexual assault. Or they may even know somebody in their own life. Because the issue is becoming much more talked about, and young people, especially women, as you can see from this picture, are really, getting adamant about this is not acceptable anymore. And we have a responsibility as a society to take it seriously. And I would say that responsibility starts at home with having some of these conversations. So what I want to do is I want to talk about 3 what I call tools that are something that you can discuss with your young person, and as a way of helping them connect with themselves, connect with their friends, and connect with what a safe and a healthy response is in a moment of risk. So, so one of the things that we talk about a lot in sexual safety is that we're here to teach the thought forms, actions, and behaviors that decrease risk. The responsibility for safe outcomes always lies primarily with the potential perpetrator or perpetrator. So sexual assault is never the responsibility of the victim. However, I do think that we have a responsibility to begin to talk with young people about the kind of action steps and thought forms that increase safety. So here's the first one. And I call it high tone, low tone. And basically what it is, it's a reaction style. It's the autonomic nervous system going to work for an individual the way that it's intended by giving us internal cues in a moment of stress. So one way to talk about this with your young person is to have them identify examples of feeling a low tone reaction, which would be a very calm internal feeling state, calm and relaxed, the opposite of agitated. And then what happens and how quickly can it happen for that low tone to go to high tone? So I give an example of, you could be hanging out in a smoothie shack with your friends and having a very low tone experience. A mother comes in and is yelling at her children in front of you and your friends. You're going to probably have a high tone reaction. And you can get very fine tuned with this discussion, but I encourage you to, have the kind of conversation where you get your young person thinking about their individual high tone, low tone reaction pattern. And then of course the second, which is completely in line with the first, is how do they talk about that? So if they are in a situation where they're uncomfortable, maybe they're in a new romantic relationship where they're starting to have moments of high tone reaction, how can they come up with the words, come up with the statements, come up with the I statement for getting some help for that situation? And, it's remarkable to me as I've done this work with young people that honestly, there aren't a lot of phrases or sentences that young people have for protecting themselves in a moment of risk. And even something as simple as, I'm uncomfortable, I gotta go, or I forgot I have to make a phone call, anything that gets that person out of a risky situation, out of an uncomfortable situation where somebody may be threatening their boundaries and getting a little bit too close, really coming up with some phrases that they can even practice. In our program, we do a lot of role plays so that young people can practice using these statements so that when they actually need to, it's much more second nature. And then the third tool, which is actually, I think, very easy to encourage young people to do because it's part of their kind of natural way of being as a young adult. And that is to use their friendships and their peers as a power group. And that's the term that I give for helping, young people helping other young people make good choices and stay safe. So an example of ways to encourage your young person to begin to think of their friendships as their power group is, talk about what pre-party planning might look like for them. And again, it's amazing how when you start having conversations with young people and you talk about like, what's your pre-party plan? They don't even really know what you're talking about sometimes because it isn't a natural part of their discussion. As they go into the world, and we know as adults because we lived it, when you go into the world, there actually are numerous situations where having a pre-party plan is crucial. So that plan could include making sure to have food before you go to a party where there's going to be alcohol consumption. Alcohol is one of the primary variables that affect assault outcomes. So, having a pre-party plan around alcohol. Having everybody keep their phone charged, having a place where they can meet up if they get separated. And most importantly, if one person in the group is looking uncomfortable, again, maybe somebody is giving them a high tone reaction, that their friends, and there can even be a secret signal that they give to each other, like, you know, pulling an earlobe or scratching a nose, so that that power group knows, okay, one of our people is in an uncomfortable situation. We need to go intervene. And so again, this is where, with this particular tool, the two previous tools can apply, because you want the group to begin to have conversations with each other around what are some of their high tone reactions? What are the situations where they start to feel that way? What are the phrases and sentences they can use to communicate their needs? And of course, how can they plan to encourage each other and encourage safe outcomes when they're out together for an evening? So these are our three tools, and we can't talk about these tools without looking at some of the challenges that come up along the way. And this is in regards to having this conversation and discussing the three tools that I mentioned with your young adult. First off, as we can, you know, guess, but we kind of don't always know how to think it through, our own personal history with sexual safety affects our level of comfort in discussing it with our children. So knowing your own personal history and how that's, you know, affected your life as a parent is a really important kind of self-to-self talk to have, or with safe friends that you can talk this through with. You know, I share very openly. I'm a survivor myself, and I know that that has affected my parenting, and has actually created some challenges for me in having these difficult conversations with my child. One of the things that we all are part of is the fact that we have raised our children, many of us, I would say it's a predominant paradigm, in child-centered homes. In other words, our approach to our children is often like they're the center of the world. And that's wonderful. And I think, you know, for me as a parent, I delighted, you know, all the time in raising my daughter. But there's a little bit of a blessing and a burden that goes along with that parenting paradigm, in that young people who are already prone to a certain level of like feeling indomitable, feeling like problems won't happen to them, they are immortal, that whole thing we remember from our youth, it gets enhanced a little bit with that child-centered parenting style, because it can potentially inflate their own sense of importance, and again, that kind of indomitable nature. So last thing, fear being contagious. I don't have to talk a whole lot about that. We have to kind of manage our own high tone reactions, our own fear. I talk about it like fear is like an inflatable balloon. It can go from 0 to 60 in a second. So managing our fear when we're having these hard conversations, so that that doesn't spill over to our young adult and you know, negatively affect the conversation. So looking at what self-care needs to happen to make that arena more open and more available to have those hard talks. So thank you, and I am happy to pass the torch back to Tonya.
Okay, so much like sexual safety, anxiety is, I think for most parents, a lot of parents who are, if you're a parent like me who has an anxious child, you realize how significant this issue is as our children leave home. But a lot of us don't realize anxiety disorders are the most common disorders among children and adolescents. I think we have heard in the news so much about hyperactivity, ADHD, autism spectrum disorders. We hear there's a lot of sort of buzzwords about this is what our kids struggle with, that we just don't realize just how many of our young children, adolescents, young adults, and even adults are walking around with anxiety. It's between 15 to 30% of our youth. Um, and that's rising, continuing to rise. It's almost doubled recently. So, well, actually, it's not doubled. It's risen 20%, but it's like, and that's an old statistic from 2013. So I feel confident that it was in 2019, it was significantly higher than 2013. And in 2020, we have had quite the year. So those people who are experiencing anxiety has really gone up dramatically. And that's not just us adults, it's also our kids and kids who are going out into the world right now, facing so much uncertainty. It's a real significant concern and issue. If you notice the stat I also include on this slide about suicidal teenagers, the reason I include a statistic about suicidal teenagers is that anxiety and depression go hand in hand. That's another like fact that we in mental health tend to know, but a lot of people out in the world don't always realize that you just very rarely would see one without the other. If someone struggles with anxiety, they also struggle with depression. 63% of college students, again, this is not in 2020, this is previous data that said 63% of college students experienced overwhelming anxiety in the past year. 23% sought treatment. So you're thinking, wow, 23% of kids had to go get treatment for anxiety. That's crazy. And it is. But what I see when I look at those two statistics next to each other is 63% probably needed help and only 23% actually went and got help. So this conversation that you can have with your young adult, your teenager, before they leave home, I consider it so, so important so that we can just raise that number. If they are feeling overwhelming anxiety, and so many of them will, understanding it, knowing what to do about it, knowing if they need to get help, such an important conversation to have. So what can we tell our kids before they leave home about anxiety? Well, the very first, most important thing that I tell every single kid, teenager, parent, children living in my home, I say this to everyone because it's so important, is anxiety is normal. I quoted a statistic on the very last slide where I said 15 to 30% of all youth will struggle with anxiety. 100% of human beings will have anxiety at some point. It is normal. And that's such an important thing for you to share with your young person, because what happens so often with our kids, and I hear it all the time, and if you have kids this age, you probably do too. The kids say things like, oh, I've got anxiety. I have anxiety. And they've made it into this thing, this illness that they deal with. And yes, an anxiety disorder is a significant illness, and I don't want to make light of it, but I also don't want to make it into something more than it has to be. When we start accepting that it is a normal part of being human to have anxiety, that takes a bit of the sting out of it. The other thing that is so important to tell our kids, especially our college students and kids that are going out into the world to do hard things, is that there's a certain amount of anxiety that's actually helpful. When you look at performance and anxiety, it's sort of like this big upside down U shape, that as your anxiety gets a little bit higher and a little bit higher, your performance gets higher. You actually perform better with a certain amount of anxiety. So when your child has to take a test, go take, these college entrance exams or their finals and their big tests in college, when they have to speak, when they have to go for a job interview, it's a great thing to tell them. A little bit of anxiety will help you perform better. It's scientifically proven. And that actually, again, it's kind of that message gets into their head and they start thinking, I'm feeling a little anxious. Oh, it's okay, because a little bit of anxiety helps me perform better. So tell them that. Make sure they know that. Tell them that before they take the SAT or the ACT or before, they go for that job interview. A certain amount of anxiety is helpful, and anxiety in general is actually normal. Another thing to remind our kids is that what we resist persists. So going back to what I said before, that if we're walking around saying, I have this terrible disease called anxiety, we also tend to do this thing where if we start feeling anxious, which, as I said, totally normal and happens to everyone, but when we start to feel that, if we think this is bad, this is an illness, this is something wrong with me, we also think, I need to do something, I need to make it stop. And when we try to fight with anxiety and to stop it and just quit thinking that or quit feeling this way, it makes it worse. So resisting anxiety is the absolute worst thing to do. Accepting it as normal, acknowledging, one phrase that I use in my house, again, with both of my kids, it's sort of a catchphrase, and I use it with clients and try and get all my clients to use it with their kids, is just to say, this is how I work. So try to start talking to your kids before they leave home. Remind them, this is how you work. And maybe this is how you work means if you don't get a lot of sleep, you don't function very well. If you don't eat regularly, you have issues. When you feel anxious, you tend to be really irritable and angry with those people around you. So when you notice you're being irritable, check in with yourself. Notice if you're feeling anxious. Remind yourself, oh, I haven't been sleeping. I haven't been eating well. It's probably affecting how I'm acting. Just, again, it's something we all experience. It's how we all work. But to accept it as how we work, as opposed to saying, oh my gosh, I've got to change this, I've got to fight it. It's a paradox. When we accept it, it actually becomes manageable. When we fight it, it becomes much, much worse. And the last thing that I encourage every parent of every age, regardless if your child's on their way to kindergarten or they're on their way to Stanford, I tell everyone, just share some simple brain hacks, because there are tons of them. And the one that I always like to share with everyone, because it's so easy and it's always accessible, is the old cliche, breathe. And the reason it's a cliche is because it actually does work when done properly. And the reason that it's gotten a bad rap is because we've just kind of said, well, just breathe. And people are like, I am breathing. I never stopped breathing. I'm breathing very quickly and very shallow breaths, and I'm feeling very anxious. So breathing doesn't work. So the trick with breathing is that these breaths have to be long, slow, deep breaths. And sometimes it helps your older kids if you actually explain to them what's happening, because there's two really cool things that happen when they tune into their breath and they use their breath as part of their toolkits of managing their anxiety. One cool thing that is happening when they use this brain hack, and actually let me just back up, and I'm going to give you one of the many, many breath brain hacks that you can use. It's called square breathing. So square breathing is very, very simple. It is simply inhaling to a count of 4, holding your breath to a count of 4, exhaling to a count of 4, holding your breath to a count of 4. So it would, if you were teaching this to your child, you would basically say, inhale 1, 2, 3, 4, hold 2, 3, 4, exhale 2, 3, 4, hold 2, 3, 4. And you can do that as long as you want. You can take your phone and go into your little voice memos and you can record yourself counting and saying those words, and then text that to your child and have them listen to it. But it's super simple. And what is happening? So two things are happening, as I said. One, when I start focusing on counting and breathing and holding and exhaling and counting, I have taken my brain out of whatever feedback loop I had going on that was causing me to feel anxious and given it something else to do. Because my brain was probably spiraling about, I can't walk into that class. I don't know anyone. There's going to be 200 people. This is going to feel so uncomfortable. I'm so scared. I don't know what. So just let's stop and count and get your body and your mind to do something else. The second thing that's happening when your child uses the breath brain hack is we have this amazing system in our brain that when we're feeling anxious, our brain can send signals to every single part of our body. Every aspect of us operates differently when our brain says, you're feeling nervous, you need to be very afraid. It dilates our pupils. It changes the respiration. It changes our blood pumping through our body. It changes the rate at which we're perspiring. It changes our digestion. I mean, every single part of our body changes. When we get long, slow, deep breaths, there's actually a feedback mechanism from our lungs back to our brain that is freaking out and saying, be very, very afraid. Those long, slow, deep breaths send a message back to our brain saying, it's okay. You have lots of oxygen. You can calm down. So mentally it changes us because we've got to focus on different thoughts. And even physiologically, it changes what's happening because it's sending a message to our brain that we're okay. So that's the kind of thing that you just want to equip your children with as they are going out into the world, so that because they are going to face anxiety, it's normal, we all do, but when they do, here's some things to remember. Now, the thing to remember when you're having this conversation with your kids, and you're probably going to have it a few times, hopefully, is that talking about anxiety can make us anxious. It is exactly the same as what Amy said when she said talking about sexual safety. We bring our own experiences to every single conversation. So if we tend to be anxious, if we have struggled with anxiety, and spoiler alert, as I just said, everybody has struggled with anxiety at some point. So if you are one of the people, you have struggled, and if you're thinking about, wow, anxiety is so terrible, I hated when I felt it, I'm going to go talk to my kid about it. That's not the right energy to bring to the conversation. If you're anxious as you're talking about anxiety, it will make your child feel anxious. So being real aware of how you're presenting and talking about this is important. Being able to make your child feel like it's okay. Anxiety is something I can handle. The other big thing to remember, and this is a struggle for people, it sounds so silly, but this is what I do for a living. I coach people. I hear it all the time. There is a difference between knowing something and actually doing it. And so many of us think, if I read a book about meditation, I'm going to become more calm. If she taught me this technique about breathing, then I'm not going to struggle with anxiety. That's not how it works, unfortunately. You can read every book in the world, including mine, but if you don't actually do the stuff, if you don't do the breathing, if you don't practice the stuff that keeps you calm and centered, it doesn't matter. Knowing doesn't make anything different. It's actually doing it. And the final thing to watch out for, that's very related to what I said earlier about understanding how you're coming to this conversation. Sometimes what we do is we don't think we need to have this conversation until our child is anxious. And then it reminds us, oh yeah, I'm supposed to tell them about how all this breathing and how to be calm and that anxiety is normal. Well, when a child is having a panic attack, you can't really do it. It's very, very difficult to teach them square breathing in the middle of a panic attack. All of this conversation and all of these tools are really best delivered when the child is in a relaxed, open, receptive place, so that when they do become anxious, they aren't learning something new. It's very hard to learn something new when your brain is freaking out. So those are the 3 tips and things you need to watch out for when talking about anxiety. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Amy to talk a little bit about social isolation.
So as Tonya pointed out earlier, this particular phenomena, social isolation, something that we're, of course, very aware of in the midst of COVID-19, but it kind of acts as a bit of a bridge between both of our separate talking points. In other words, social isolation affects sexual safety and it affects anxiety. So one of the things that I found really disheartening when Tonya actually shared this stat with me, and you see it here, it's number 1, 64% of college freshmen report feeling very lonely in their first year of school. So if we think about our own experiences back when we went to college, it probably was a lonely time, at least part of the year, but that seems like a pretty high number to me. And now that we're launching our young people in the midst of a pandemic, I get even more worried about that stat. So I feel like similar to, Tonya's conversation around helping children manage anxiety, my conversation helping adult children manage their safety and their boundaries, we kind of have a responsibility to talk with our kids, our young adults, around how do they respond to social isolation? How are they going to approach this phenomena? And again, similar to the way that we've conducted this whole class today, starting with some of these statistics, starting with a very neutral, objective conversation where, even that first stat of, 64% of college freshmen say they felt lonely in the first year. So what does that mean to you? What does that mean to how you're thinking about this next chapter? And there are some things that you can talk to your young adult child about in managing social isolation. And number 1 is understanding the risks involved. So as we know, social isolation creates loneliness. That can create anxiety and depression. So it is a risk factor as far as mental health. Of course, social isolation is a risk factor as far as, my area of expertise, sexual safety, because when there is social isolation, sometimes that's what leads to choices and behaviors that are a little bit more risky. Because again, young people are wanting to do what they can do to address the fact that they're lonely, address the fact that they feel isolated. So just having a very open conversation with your young adult around the risks to social isolation. Number 2, help them create a plan before they actually need it. And this is something that I think as parents, and I know I've been guilty of it myself, we do a lot of kind of relying on the systems within which our children are getting educated to do some of this kind of creative planning and creative problem solving. But actually, like, the most important place for this to start is at home. Because your kid, you know the kind of person that they are. You can have a very natural conversation around their personality and what they need based on their awareness of who they are as a person. So how does that plan get carried out? There's a lot of ways of doing that. It can, of course, begin with self-care. What are some of the things that they can do for themselves? And then, lastly, and I think it cannot be stressed enough, have them come up with a list of people that they can turn to if they are in a rough spot, if they are starting to feel a little bit isolated. So this could be a list of people that they have in their home community that, you both know. And of course, it's also important to bridge to their new environment, whether that be a college, whether that be in a new town that they're moving to, perhaps they got a job in another city, helping them begin to identify the people in their world even if it's like a new coworker or a classmate or a college counselor, a co-member of a club, even if they don't necessarily know who that person is yet, they can begin to identify what it feels like to be in conversation with, again, for example, a new roommate, and gauge their comfort level, gauge whether they could actually open up a little bit. And then, of course, you're doing those other conversations at home where they can practice having those I statements, expressing what their feelings might be, expressing when they feel anxious, expressing when they feel scared, so that they can begin to connect their feeling state with the language that they're using to communicate to the people in their life. And I know this sounds so basic, but again, you and I as adults, Tonya and I as adults, we came to this through lived experience. I guarantee that none of us, for example, at age 29, we knew things at that age we did not know at 19. So we kind of, again, have this opportunity, responsibility, this wonderful, chance to connect with our kids in a way that's empowering. So, just as final, Tanya's going to talk about the things to watch out for. So I'll start with a couple, and then she's going to follow up and take us to we're almost ready to wrap up. So things to watch out for as far as the social isolation piece. Again, that sense of empowerment, that sense of immortality that kids often have, they don't necessarily understand how they might feel once they leave home. So there isn't going to be that perception of, well, I might be lonely when I leave home, so I've got to figure out a plan. We have to encourage a conversation that helps them connect with that awareness, helps them understand that they need to, again, talk about it beforehand. Social distancing can create peer pressure. So helping your young person identify their experiences with peer pressure while in high school, so they can talk cogently about what they learned, what do they want to bring to college based on some of those experiences, and how do they want to manage the fact that social distancing is going to affect that. There might be more peer pressure in certain areas that are new because of COVID. How do they want to manage that when they leave home? What do they, again, their personality and their coping style, their level of anxiety, their high tone, low tone, what are they bringing to those scenarios that involve peer pressure? And of course, knowing the warning signs. A lot of young people, and this again is just a product of being young and not having that lived experience, they may feel what it's like to be uncomfortable or be off or just kind of, not really excited about life. They may not equate that with anxiety or depression. So helping to, begin to look for and talk about what the signs are when there's, again, some social isolation, maybe a little anxiety that's starting to show up. So Tonya is going to take it from here.
Yeah, and just to build on what Amy said, those signs, often our kids and even adults don't realize things that mean what they mean. So sometimes irritability is a sign of depression and anxiety. So that's the conversation that you kind of want to have with your kids, is to look for those things that, we all have an idea of what anxiety looks like, nervousness, and depression looks like sadness, but it doesn't always. It doesn't always look exactly like that. And the signs of social isolation taking a toll on kids can be things like them appearing to choose social isolation. They are choosing not to leave their room or interact with other people. And it might look like that's a choice, but it's actually a sign that they are becoming overly isolated and going down a bad path. So that's a little nuanced part of that conversation I would add to everything that Amy said that was so awesome, is that it doesn't always look like you think it's going to look. So before we move to this last part, I'm sure some of you have a few questions that we will love to answer, but before we do, I do just want to let you know that Amy and I are offering a workshop for young adults. It is next week. It will be July 28th and 29th. This is actually for the young adults. It's not for the parents like this webinar masterclass. This is for your young adult who's getting ready to leave home. Amy and I will kind of have some of these conversations like we were just sharing with you. We are going to talk to them directly about managing their stress and anxiety, knowing those signs, knowing what to look for, how they can feel safe and connected so that they are managing their social isolation, and how they can remain safe and build healthy relationships. So we would love to give you more information. It is all available on my website at guidanceforthefuture/staying safe, sane, and healthy as you leave home. That is a very long URL address, so do not worry if you're listening to this and thinking I need to write it down. You don't. I will email it to you. I will also email you our addresses so that you can email us directly at Tonya@guidanceforthefuture.com or amycarpenter458@gmail.com. This will be in my follow-up email to everyone, especially those of you who are watching this as a recording. You will have that in the email that you got this recording in. So if you would like to reach out to us, that is where to reach us. I am going to go ahead and stop screen share, and I am going to stop the recording. But before I do, I'd just like to say a big thank you to those of you who watched it. And